thanks for being out here with us tonight. I'm going to introduce Jamie real quick. You know, probably he's the Gary and Henrietta Piper Chair in the Philosophy Department at Calvin University. Award-winning author of numerous books, including You Are What You Love and On the Road with St. Augustine. I was thinking one thing, I do intros for him a couple times, and it's always, you know, right off. One thing I can say, maybe as a compliment, is
maybe as a compliment.
Let's see. I was preparing some questions, and I had the very first draft, which I printed off, and I've written a bunch of notes on. And I was reading through that, coming up with questions. Then I was comparing it with the final manuscript, and it's interesting to see how much better it gets. And I can tell you, I didn't introduce myself. Jeremy Wells, marketing director at Process Press. Authors don't always take the care that Jamie does with books. And it's just a real gift that somebody, an author, takes that much time to prepare a manuscript and then hands it to us. And then we spend a whole other year in collaboration with them, making it better. And so I was just thinking as I was looking through that and creating notes, like what a gift this book is and how much work and thought that Jamie has brought to the project.
Me? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks so much for being here. Apparently, we're doing this as like fireside chat. I feel like I should be in a smoking gown or something. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Baker Bookhouse, and thanks for all of you for being here. It's fun to see some familiar faces and some new faces. What we're going to do is I'm going to just talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then Jeremy and I will have a little bit of a conversation, but then we'll open it up so that we can all be in conversation. I thought I would tell you a little bit about where this book is coming from, but then also I would like to read a little bit from it because I actually kind of believe in it. But also because I appreciate what you said, Jeremy, because I think I really love working on sentences in this book. And so we'll see. I just want you to get a taste of it, if that sounds all right. How to Inhabit Time is in some ways, it's kind of like the grandchild of, or I don't know. It is, at least in the lineage of my earlier books, You Are What You Love and On the Road with St. Augustine, in the sense that they are both books that are concerned with the dynamics of spiritual formation, the formation of habit, how we are shaped and formed by the rhythms and practices that we are immersed in. But and in that sense, I kind of situate myself in a wider conversation about spiritual formation that would include folks like Dallas Willard, and Richard Foster, and Tish Harrison Moore, and those kinds of conversations. But it struck me that one of the things that's been sort of missing, or at least under accounted for in those conversations, is the fact that we are temporal creatures, that we inhabit time, that we sort of live in and through and in the midst of a history that shapes us over time, that we are not just static, we're not just always the same, we are being formed, and the way time unfolds and the way history unfolds shapes and changes who we are. So the me that is with God when I'm 20 is very, very different than the me who is with God when I'm 50. And I'm not sure that our conversations about spiritual formation have taken those dynamics of time and temporality and history seriously enough. So in some ways, this book is just trying to start that conversation, sort of step into that a little bit. I will say too, I think this book very much came out of some of our kind of collective reckoning with history over the past several years. I say that in a sense, this book kind of has three beats to what I'm calling spiritual timekeeping. It's an invitation to a way of inhabiting time that I'm going to call spiritual timekeeping. And I try to emphasize that it has these sort of three beats, which is reckoning, discernment, and hope. So the way, or as the subtitle puts it, understanding the past, facing the future, and living faithfully now. This sense of reckoning, discernment, and hope is meant to say, one of the things we have to do if we're going to live faithfully is we need to sort of reckon with our pasts, with the histories that have been handed down to us. And I mean that both individually, like we each have our own stories. We each have our own narratives that we have lived out. We each have histories that we don't even remember, right? That the body keeps score, as we say, right? We carry histories in us, but individually, but also collectively, right? We as a collective, it could be the United States of America, it could be this congregation, it could be West Michigan, it could be Grand Rapids. There's all kinds of collectives where we have these histories that are before us, precede us, that have been handed down to us, and we need to reckon with them. And now, in many cases, I think that means confronting the histories that we've buried, that we've forgotten, that we haven't faced up to. And I would say the murder of George Floyd happened early on as I was thinking about this book, and that was a jarring sort of reality to grapple with. But when I say reckon with the past, I don't just mean it in that sort of difficult sense, but it's a big part of it. Reckoning with the past is also recognizing the gifts that I inherit. It's actually looking with gratitude to what has been handed down to me as a possibility, so that now I can live out a certain calling. So we reckon with the past, and the calling to live faithfully is hinges on discernment. It's like, what are we called to now, given this past? Because ultimately, the whole point of reckoning with our past is so that we can be a people who live towards the future that God is calling us to. So it's never just about like, turning back a clock. It's not just getting fixated with our ancestry or something like that. It's just understanding who we are and when we are, so that we can answer the call to be what God is calling us to in the future. So that, I hope that makes sense. Because I'm back to a long way. You have to buy the book. So I thought, but I want I'll say one more thing. It's very much operative on two levels or two registers. This is true of our collectives and our communities. Our communities need to do this work of reckoning and discernment and answering the call of hope. But it's also very intimately personal. Each one of us needs to reckon with our stories, with our histories, and discern what God is calling me to in this moment, so that I can live forward in hope. And so what I want to do is, I thought I would read a little bit, if that sounds okay. And these are I hope representative, but there's a lot more going on in the book than I can possibly read to you tonight. So I'm trying to keep an eye on time a little bit. Let's see how this goes. I want to read this is from the beginning of chapter 2, which is called A History of the Human Heart. Time is more fungible than you might guess. Because we have quantified and externalized it in the watch on my wrist, or the phone in my pocket, or the clock tower on City Hall, we're used to assuming that time has been standardized. Measurement is mastery. And such mastery of time has been globalized with systems of universal translation. A day is 24 hours, whether in Beijing or Boulder. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And so with all the days that have followed. But then a writer like Barry Lopez reminds you that this experience of time is not universal. Even a day is elastic in a sense. Morning and evening don't always arrive. He recounts this dawning realization in an Arctic village. This is Barry Lopez. As I walked through the village, I realized I had never understood this before. In a far northern winter, the sun surfaces slowly on the south, in the south, and then disappears at nearly the same spot, like a whale rolling over. The idea that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west simply does not apply. The thought that a day consists in a morning and a forenoon, an afternoon and an evening, is a convention. One so embedded in us we hardly think about it. A convention in our literature and our art. The pattern is not the same here in the art. As Lopez notes, this malleability of morning and evening changes what it means to grow. The Arctic, he says, receives strangely the same amount of sunshine in a year as the tropics. That, which is kind of positive. That's kind of a fascinating thing, right? So the Arctic receives the same amount of sunshine in a year as the tropics, but it comes all at once and at a low angle of incidence without critical vigor. So objectively speaking, you might say, the Arctic and the equator receive the same amount of sunshine. The critical difference, of course, is when and how. Not even the nonstop sunshine of an Arctic summer can make up for this night. The same amount of sunlight is not equally distributed. And given that virtually all of the Earth's biological systems are driven by solar radiation, the differences in our days and nights translate into differences of possibility. What counts as growth is pegged to this elasticity of time. One more quote from Lopez. Trees in the Arctic have an aura of implacable endurance about them. A cross-section of the bole of a Richardson willow, no thicker than your finger, may reveal an annual growth of 200 rings beneath the magnifying glass. Much of the tundra, of course, appears to be treeless, when in many places it is actually covered with trees. A thick matting of short, ancient willows and birches. You realize suddenly that you are wandering on top of a forest. What if the first 18 years of your life were an Arctic winter? What if all the sunlight in your life comes late, at an oblique angle? What if the sun cyclically disappears from your life for nights that seem like they'll never end? To grow just one membraned layer under such conditions is a feat. To add another ring to endure is an achievement. Some years are longer than others. So don't compare your sturdy temperate trees to your neighbor's Arctic forest. You can't imagine how much implacable energy it took to grow those saplings. You might not be able to fathom what they have endured. You don't know how ancient that forest is, how much time it has spent enveloped in darkness. Even more important, don't compare the trees of your tundra existence to someone else's equatorial rainforest. God doesn't. They live in different conditions. The sun shines upon the just and the unjust, sure, but not at the same angle or with the same intensity. The birch saplings that have punched up through the crust of your prior life are miracles of grace. Remember when you thought nothing could ever grow there? They've never lived through your winter. They don't know how long your night has been. By the grace of God, you've endured the dark. Okay, so that's a little taste. So I'm trying to use some metaphor, you get the sanctification analogy and things like that. Let me do kind of just a little bit more. It's kind of my night, so I want to try to do two little things. One of the things I try to point out is our temptation to nostalgia when it comes to thinking about history. So what I would like to do is I want to read a little section about our especially maybe American Christian temptation towards nostalgia. And then I want to think about what that looks like in a personal life. If that's okay. All right, everybody with me? You're very kind. The question isn't just whether we have a history and a future, or even whether we recognize this. The question is how we relate to our past and history. There is a sort of fascination with the past that is an act of deliberate forgetting. It's called nostalgia. Religious communities are particularly prone to this. Faith, of course, is handed down, a matter of traditio, and hence faithfulness can be confused with preserving the past, rather than having gratitude for a legacy meant to propel us forward. The most significant problem with nostalgia is not that it remembers, but what it forgets. So much of the trouble of this world is caused by memories, writes Ashley Cherry Gerard, for we only remember half. So much of the trouble of this world is caused by memories, because we only remember half. The past that is pined for is always selected, edited, preserved in amber, and thus decontextualized. And even if this past is invoked as marching orders for the restoration and recovery, whenever the past is invoked as a template for the present, the first question we should always ask is, whose past? Whose version of the past? And what does this invoked past ignore, override, actively forget? Whose half is recalled, whose half is forgotten? Such nostalgia is always a form of arrested development. For example, there are sorts of nostalgia that are not so subtle longings for adolescence and thus resent adulthood. It's a curious, I do think college alumni culture actually feeds off very, very powerful. Many forms of collective nostalgia demonize the present while luxuriating in a fabled past. As Tony Soprano once put it, remember when is the lowest form of conversation. But in most cases, and in our collective life, nostalgia usually serves a social and political agenda that wants to reprise a configuration of society that secured a way of life that is being romanticized. All too often, that way of life benefited some, who now remember it fondly, at the expense of others who were ground underfoot by the so-called golden age. So I say, as you can imagine, I have a lot to say about nostalgia. The last thing I want to be is, I want to tease that out and move now from that sort of social, political, cultural level to a personal level. Thinking about nostalgia and the temptations of nostalgia at the personal level. And for me, this is fundamentally the contrast between the dynamics of shame versus grace. God's grace does not lift us above the vicissitudes of time's flow. Rather, the God who appears in the fullness of time catches all that's been thrown our way in an embrace that launches us into a future that could only be ours, because only we have lived this life that Christ redeems. While repentance is a turning, it should not be confused with nostalgic regret for the life thrown our way. On a collective level, we said that nostalgia is often a romanticized version of the past. On an individual level, while our culture does romanticize childhood and adolescence, there is a more insidious version of nostalgia in negative: shame. Shame is a nefarious enemy of grace that thrives on the backward glance. Shame keeps craning our necks to look at our past with downcast eyes as a life to regret. There are highly spiritualized forms of this fixation that parade themselves as holiness. But in fact, this is the antithesis to grace. Shame lives off the spiritual lie of self-improvement, which is why my past is viewed as a failure. Grace lives off the truth of God's wonder-working mercy. My past my story, is taken up into God and God's story. God is writing a new chapter of my life. He's not starting a new book after throwing out the first draft of my prior existence. Shame denies that our very being is possibility, whereas grace, by its nature, is futural. Grace is the good news of unfathomable possibility. God's sanctifying presence in my life doesn't erase what's gone before. Indeed, what God has prepared for me depends on what has gone before. My personal history isn't something to regret. It is something God can deploy in ways I never could have imagined. Now, none of this, of course, explains or justifies the traumas we suffer. Grace is not a retroactive magic that makes evil good. Easter Sunday's light doesn't obliterate the long, dark shadows of Holy Saturday. Grace doesn't justify it. Grace overcomes it. That we are more than conquerors doesn't make the distress a blessing or the sword a plowshare. What changes is who is with us and what God can do with our suffering. Shame teaches me to look at my past and see something hideous that makes me regret my existence. In grace, God looks at my past and sees the sketch of a work of art that he wants to finish painting and show the world. Shame wants us to regret our thrownness. Grace wants us to see it as thrown possibility. Nostalgia wants to undo time, walk it all back, as if there were some sort of recovery. Grace wants to unleash our history for a future with God that could only be ours, living into the version of ourselves that the world needs. Shame, what I'm calling nostalgia and negative, keeps looking back too, but in a way that paralyzes, crushes, disheartens. If nostalgia romanticizes the past as bliss, shame can't imagine a future for our past. Grace is not a time machine. Grace is not a reset button. Grace is something even more unbelievable. It is a restoration. It is a reconciliation of and despite our histories of animosity. Grace isn't an undoing. It is an overcoming. All right, I'll stop.
Sure.
Great.
That might be better than what I got. Actually, ironically, I think I have some questions that hit all three of those readings. So
Okay.
not planned.
Okay, great.
So I'll ask a couple questions, but start preparing questions, and then Becky's gonna grab a mic and we'll get something. So the first one, I love that passage about the trees, but you also talk about sunset, sunrise, not knowing which is which, and then you also call the book an orientation project, or
Yeah.
navigation project.
Yeah.
So we talk more about that. Why, when it makes a difference? Why not understand?
Yeah, why when makes a difference. Yeah, is it what's the line from the Josh Ritter song? There's a Josh Ritter song where it's like, I thought the sun was going down, but the sun was coming up. Do you know what I mean? Like you could have a moment where you see the sun is framed on the horizon and the colors, and if you just took a snapshot of it, you wouldn't necessarily know whether it was dawn or dusk, right? You wouldn't necessarily know if it was sunrise or sunset. And so this great song, I thought the sun was going down, but the sun was coming up. And what that means is you discerning your context. This is why discernment matters, right? It's like so much hinges on our ability to read the moment in which we find ourselves in light of God's story, rather than just resorting to the resources of what we think is possible. Right? So somebody might look at a moment in our history or a moment in their own life, and if your only frame was something like, calculative, rational possibilities based on science or something like that, you might think, oh no, this is the end, right? We're experiencing the end. But if you zoom out and you start to see and read your context in light of God's story. It reframes now, oh, I thought the sun was going down, but actually, I thought this was an end. But now that I see in God's realm of possibilities and in God's story that this is a beginning. And I think that sort of transforms. Now that's hard work. One of the things I think that people might find slightly frustrating is everything hinges on discernment, but there are no formulas and tips and tricks for the hard work of discernment. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's not like, here's the checklist that you go through in order to know what time it is. No, it's always ad hoc. We're always doing this on the way, in the middle of where we find ourselves. And that's why we need to do it communally and with one another to try to take a read on that. I don't know if I answered your question. Is that all right? Okay.
The second reading was kind of more about the collective memory.
Yes. Yes.
One of the quotes I wrote down is, you said hopes are inherited, so are idolatries. And
Hopes
so
are inherited, but so are idolatries.
you talk about kind of the negative inheritance. That,
Yes, yes. So one of the things that, so I'm a philosopher. And I'm unapologetically a philosopher, and I think that philosophy can change your life. And I think philosophy can teach you how to live. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is I do think there are some philosophical insights about what it is to be human that have a lot of spiritual repercussions and ramifications. And so one of those threads is the fact that, look, to be human is to mean I always experience and encounter the world with sort of a background that has trained me how to encounter the world. Can I give you a kind of corny example of this? How many of you know the movie The Little Mermaid? Little Mermaid? Okay, yeah. One of the Disney greats. Do you remember when the Little Mermaid is under the sea? And remember Scuttle always had this like sort of museum of human artifacts that he shows her, a fork and a pipe and things like that. And the problem is that she's entirely dependent on Scuttle's interpretations in order to know what a fork is, and what she calls it a dingle hopper, which is for combing your hair. So my point is, in a sense, Ariel's encounter with that world is dependent on a particular background that is of possibilities that have been handed down to her by that community, which is like Scuttle and you know, the undersea community kind of thing. And so what that means is the way she experiences the world is conditioned by that inheritance. That's true of being human. Like the way you imagine the world, the way you experience the world is something that you have inherited from a community, multiple communities that you are a part of. And in fact, you couldn't have experience if you didn't have that inheritance. You couldn't be human without that historical indebtedness. However, those inheritances are never mutual. Right? So that's why reckoning with my past is realizing, oh, some of these things that have been handed down to me open up God's world. And they've made it possible for me to experience the fullness of other human beings and the mystery of God's mercy and grace. But some of my inheritances shut down possibilities, right? Like they've twisted my capacity to actually be able to see my neighbor or to open up possibilities in the world. And so when we talk about reckoning, it's partly trying to like judge and bring to the surface, okay, what have I inherited and have they really gifted me? Or have I been trained to say idolize certain things? Our idolatries are, you don't usually sign up for your idolatries. And I don't even think most of our idolatries are matters of belief. I think most of our idolatries are a matter of basically how we have learned to expect from the world and where we expect meaning and significance.
That last section you read, I think you have a great illustration of this. That's an AD story. So.
Yeah. So you love this story, don't you? So one of the things that's interesting, you remember the encounter between Jesus and Nicodemus? When Jesus tells him, you must be born again. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that encounter is, in a sense, Nicodemus's capacity to imagine the again is sort of nostalgic, you might say, or it's limited, because what happens is he thinks, oh, if I'm going to be born again, what you must be talking about is turning back time, starting over, and getting to the blank slate. I think a lot of functional Christian conceptions of conversion and salvation are blank slate versions, where what they imagine goes on in redemption and salvation is, oh, it's a reset button, like a video game, right? Oh, now it's like I'm a blank check, new start, blank slate, and now God is starting over. And that's kind of what Eddie means. So he's like, wait, I'm gonna sort of crawl back in. How's that gonna work? And he can't imagine what Jesus is talking about. What redemption is not the reset, it's not the turning back the clock to getting to the blank slate. It's something even more astounding, which is with my history, with my traumas, with my failures, God is restoring that guy, is saving that person. Because if salvation was reset, if salvation was just turned back and getting to some sort of blank slate, in a sense, I am not saved. Do you know what I mean? Jamie now is the guy who has gone through these experiences, who has lived this history. And what is remarkable is that God can redeem even that. If you want, the difference between reset and restoration and resurrection is that you still see the scars, right? The one who is resurrected still bears the scar. It's not a reset to a new character in the game. And I think that changes how we think, not only how we think about evangelism, I think it changes how we think about sanctification as well. We want to talk theology.
Yeah, I'm tempted to keep going, but I will open it up. Does anybody have a question? Yep. Here we go.
Here comes Mike. Not that Matt needs to speak for voice.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jimmy. Good thought provoking. But I wonder if this is true, that in the opening talk of the trees, the telling time and knowing your place are linked
Very much.
together, right?
Very much.
At that point. So I wonder if you play with the metaphor even a little bit more, and it's something like this. So in West Michigan, when the land gets scarred, right? You wipe it out, sumac trees show up. And sumac trees look like weeds, but really what they're doing is holding the soil in place until the oak tree comes along, right? And so it's not only a matter of looking at a tree over time,
Right.
seeing the rings, but it's also looking at your neighbor and saying, oh, they still have sumac trees, but there's a purpose, right, in that place over that.
Yeah, I love it. I love it because you're. I also love it that we're talking about the intersection of time and place in some ways here. And some people have asked me, well, are you going to talk about place? And I was like, no, I don't have to, because Matt Bonzo and Norman Wiersbe have already written those books. You know what I mean? Like I don't need to do the place. What I hear you saying is, in some ways, if you want to tell what time it is, to read, in this case, like the fauna of an environment is itself its own sort of canary in a coal mine to tell you something about when we are. I love that. I love that. And I wonder if you ran with that metaphor, like, let's say you're a congregation, right? And you're sort of grappling and saying, when are we as a congregation? I bet it looks something like reading the soil, like what's possible for us right now, and which is probably also reckoning with what we have not sustained, right? Like what we have not nourished so that we can keep growing in this way. What does it look like to get to something better? I love it. I love that metaphor. It's great. Thank you.
Okay, more questions?
So I had a quick question was, how do you discern or understand what backgrounds and pieces of our past, both collective and individual, are helpful and what backgrounds are unhelpful?
Yes, so the $64 million question, I mean, it's so, so I'm not punting. To ask that question of our backgrounds and past is already such a new level of intentionality, right? So I would say, one hope is if this could occasion people asking themselves personally and communally those kinds of questions, then we would have already moved to a new degree of intentionality. Because otherwise what happens is we just kind of run on autopilot and the defaults, and we don't realize that we've inherited these things. So then the question of, what constitutes a gift and what constitutes a poison is going to be kind of contextually sensitive, it seems to me, and is going to probably require the insight of others than myself, because I need others to, I'm going to have blind spots that are going to make it very, very difficult for me to discern that. But ultimately, I think it has to be a question of what opens up possibilities to live into God's mission versus what is shutting down the possibilities of living into the fullness of what God wants, shalom, however we might think about that. And that's still, I realize that's still very abstract, but does that start to get at some of it? It's trying to say, what are the ways of being that we've inherited that enable us to live as God's image bearers for the world and for our neighbors? And what are the ways that we've inherited, maybe that we never realized, that created habits that are actually shutting down that capacity to be God's image bearers for our neighbors? And this is a lifelong endeavor, obviously, right? And part of the dynamism of time is that we will always have to be doing this kind of stock taking, which is why I do think there's kind of different seasons of reckoning. Like one of the later chapters is focused on seasonality as different. It's natural for us to experience kind of seasons or chunks of a life where I'm grappling with this kind of thing, and then in another season, God is asking me to grapple with this kind of reality, and that's natural, normal, and good in that sense. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Please.
Does it also, like in the same conversation, does it depend on your interpretation of interpretation? Like your book, Fall Interpretation, this present immediacy of understanding the goodness with badness of the past or the present, or is it eschatological immediacy, or is it kind of a creational hermeneutic, like those different paradigms that you discussed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of me wants to say, I don't think you have to do all of that kind of hermeneutical work to do this sort of the practice and discipline of discernment is what we're talking about. But I do think you probably, I'm just gonna talk to you for a sec. You guys don't have to care about this part. But I would say hermeneutics of immediacy are probably postures that are not very prone to even recognize that they have an inheritance or a past, right? They're working with, in fact, I would say, one of the things I talk about in the book are various forms of what I call know-when Christianities. Know-when Christianity. And it's actually an exact parallel to what you're talking about, because in the same way that some people think they have a view from nowhere, it's like, well, you might be interpreting the Bible, but I'm just reading it. Congratulations, bro. Because they think they have some standpoint that is, unindebted to anything else, but we know that's an illusion, right? In the same way, I think that probably correlates with what I call in here know-when Christianities, which also believe that they are completely above the flux of time. And so they can give you the big map of what all of history is happening, because really they don't stand within it. Now, I think there's only one being who's not subject to history. And it's not me, right? They kind of claim something of God's eternality for their own standard. So yeah, that's, I think know when and the view from nowhere are probably going to go. Yeah, interesting question.
So you touched on something I was gonna ask you. I think that chapter about seasons, the subtitle of that is how to love what you lose or how to love what you lose.
Yes,
So I wanted
yes.
to talk about, how to
Yeah.
love what you lose in seasons.
It's actually a different chapter, Jeremy, but you tell me you read that Caesar. So chapter 4 might be my favorite chapter. It's called Embrace the Ephemeral, How to Love What You Lose. And one of the things that interests me is, do we still have, no. I do think what we're talking about when we talk about taking time and history seriously is basically embracing our mortality. But to reckon with our mortality is not exactly the same, or it's not reducible to just saying you are going to die. It includes that. But what it also means is that you are the kinds of beings who live through time, which means you lose things. Things come to be and pass away. And so reckoning with and learning how to live with the fact that it is creaturely to lose. It is creaturely to see things come to be and pass away, and to not live in resentment of that, I think is its own sort of spiritual discipline, right? You could say a lot of American culture is bent on a resentment of times passing, right? It's why we idolize youth and adolescence and plastic surgery and whatever it might be. Whereas I think one of the healthiest ways of being mortal before God is actually living in a healthy way into the fact that, I'm not going to be 30 forever. It's funny. I remember the time when I thought 30 was ancient. Now I'm like, well, you can't be 30 forever. So Saint Benedict, in his rule, talked about what he called Memento Mori, right? Remember you will die. I talk about Memento Tempori. Remember that you are temporal. Remember that things are coming to be and passing away. And to learn how to grapple with that, I think is a healthy part of a healthy spirituality. I hope.
Other questions? Yes.
The one of the words that connected for me was nostalgia.
Yeah.
Collective nostalgia. And I have been a Catholic all my life, pretty active in various roles by way of employment and worship and so forth. And you yourself have had some experience at a Catholic college, University of Villanova. And what I have seen in recent years, last 10, 15 years, there seems to be a growing interest, not with people my age, which is, 50 and over, but people who are 50 and under, and especially some of our newly ordained priests in the last 15 to 20 years. They seem to really be connecting with the church of the 1950s. So I think,
Pre-Vatican II.
yeah, Latin Mass, some very anti-Pope Francis. And how can you have nostalgia for something you never really experienced? But they seem to be connected to this nostalgia, and it's coming forth in a variety of ways in our congregations.
I completely track with you. I would say that you can be nostalgic for what you've never experienced even more powerfully because you can romanticize it, right? So since you were never there, what happens now is you can invent the version of the past that you think you are recovering. And I understand where it comes from. I get that there is something about a certain kind of erosion that characterizes late modernity, that people are looking for a kind of stability. I just think that to me, it's a turn back the clock to a selective memory, right? And in a way, you can invent a history and then tell yourself you're recovering. And I think you're right, by the way, that that's true in the Roman Catholic Church, but there's lots of nostalgia to go around, you know what I mean? And I think, and notice, I'm not, you will find an equal critique in my book of a bland and unthinking progressivism, right? Which is a kind of imagining that we also could invent the future perfectly. So burn all down, raise everything to the ground because we are always better and smarter than what has come before us. I think both of those are very, very disordered ways of relating to time. And that what St. Augustine's City of God embodies is sort of living in that stretched gift of inheriting what God has handed down to us, but for the sake of propelling into a future of eschatological law. And for my money, Pope Francis is doing that great.
I was gonna ask the eschatologists.
Okay.
So you just said that. Yeah, talk about that. So, because part of this is, how to face the future.
Right.
Talk about like proper eschatology, what that is, what that isn't.
Yeah, so one of the things I try to distinguish in the book is between there are also, disordered, but there are different ways of relating to your future. And I came to Christian faith through like Bible prophecy conferences. And so it's interesting that sometimes we imagine end times fixation is a very futural form of Christianity, right? And that sort of in the church I was shaped in, the basement had one of Clarence Larkin's charts, just papered on the wall, and it was the 7,000 years of human history, and I've got the map of everything that's going on. And what's tricky, it looks like it's interested in history, but it's actually not. It thinks it floats above history, and it's just waiting for history to count down so we can get out of time. So it's not actually very historically attuned at all. And that end times fixation is really just kind of waiting for the escape pod out of time. Whereas I think that the sort of biblical vision of eschatological longing for the kingdom is being a people who are always praying thy kingdom come. And we are living towards it and we are longing for it. But that future reaches back into us now. And it's sort of like the magnetic attraction that pulls out of us a way of life that is trying to give a foretaste of that coming king. And so on the one hand, I think Christians should be so distinctively marked by this longing and expectation. On the other hand, I don't think that we should ever imagine that we are instantiating the kingdom in the meantime. Do you know what I mean? So I think we have to have sort of very carefully tempered expectations of what we could pull off, right? The kingdom is both something that we await, but it's not something that we create. Does that sound fair? We are laboring and we hope that our work is taken up in what God is doing, but I think we deal with a lot of over-realized eschatology right now, where a lot of people seem very confident that they know exactly what the kingdom of God should look like, but they are having to institute it. And I think, and there's both left and right versions of that, but, and that makes me kind of nervous.
It reminds me of the Augustine quote, not to put ahead of time.
Yes. Yeah. In this letter, he says, he writes to a Roman governor who kind of is like getting a little impatient and wants to make the kingdom come. And Augustine writes, he says, we ought not to want to live ahead of time with only the saints and righteous. We ought not want to live ahead of time with only the saints and righteous. It's sort of Augustine's way of saying, like, don't be surprised that the world frustrates you. You know, it's not your job to separate the wheat and the tares. I think not living ahead of time is a very wise counsel.
And then it goes on, you have some faithful compromise, like how we can live in the meantime.
Right, right. Yeah, this notion of faithful compromise is saying, because I think what happens is that if you think you know exactly what the kingdom of God should look like, and you're willing to institute it, there's sort of no room for you. You expect purity and perfection. And so you lose any capacity to tolerate compromise, because it's like, no, it has to be our way because we know exactly how it's supposed to be. But to me, that's trying to live ahead of time. Like you're trying to sort of race ahead to the end, which is not our job to institute. And I think faithful compromise is not just like selling the farm, but there's discernment about, okay, what battle are we going to pick? What goods are we going to achieve? What goods are we going to prioritize? And Christians, by the way, will disagree about these things. Like these are matters of prudential differences of judgment. And I think we need to restore our capacity to have those conversations.
Other questions? So I grew up in a similar type of congregational setting that you described, and kind of this jettisoning of history and floating the bucket and all of this. So what is the mechanism that for communities like that, for congregations or individuals with those tendencies, what's the mechanism that can pull them into history?
So the question was, how, if folks are sort of shaped by that, like above the fray or maybe end times fixations, how do you kind of break out of that? I think probably by everybody having had time. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I mean, I try to think about my own biography. Like, how did I sort of how did I find my way to something else? I think it mostly comes from realizing how utterly novel and modern that way of reading the Bible is. I think that was part of the first thing for me, is to realize I thought this was like just sort of fell from heaven with the New Testament. And then you realize nobody's reading the Bible this way until like about 1828. You know, that this is quite an interesting. And then you start reading some of the earlier fathers of the church, and that's, for me, someone reading like Augustine, realize, oh, there's a very, very different way to read the book of Revelation, for example. And it actually is more prophetically powerful. So I don't know if I have a program like a sort of detox of dispensationalism, but it's more just trying to. Probably it also depends on having a theology of creation. That would be a big part for me too. Is coming up with a theology that affirms the goodness of creation, and that includes affirming the goodness of time. And I guess I'm trying to put those two things together. Yeah. Richard Middleton actually has a great Baker academic book called A New Heaven and a New Earth, which is a great articulation of that kind of creational theology. Something like that is such an ideal way, I think. Let's not talk about prophecy and let's not talk about eschatology. Let's talk about creation and rebuild from there. It's a great question.
I guess, is there then you think some correlation between like modernity and enlightenment regarding mortality, even with the sense of maybe like our idea of Platonism and kind of having a mind that rises above everything, kind of playing into your creation. Well, I have no question here, but there's some sort of correlation here between modernity and enlightenment with the mortality and time.
Yes. I do think that there is. So if we think of modernity, say, as it's shaped by someone like Descartes or, sort of thinking thing, it is a remarkably atemporal construal of the human being. And you've made, so I teach modern philosophy, so I care about this stuff too much. I'll do the short version. In early modern philosophy, from like 1600 up to about Kant in the 1750s, there is just really no place for history. There's just no way for thinking about the fact that the soul has a past or that the mind has a past. And I would say one of the things that has intrigued me, and so in that sense, I think we might still be heirs of that, right? So we are kind of rationalists. We reduce human beings to thinking things, brains on a stick. And so therefore, it's not surprising that that brain on a stick doesn't have a past. We imagine. One of the things that interests me, and it shows up a little bit in the book, is I do think there's a really important term within modernity itself. First in Kant, but then especially in Hegel. This is more than you care about, but where now actually philosophers start saying, wait a second, history makes a difference. Like human identity is not just this floating soul or mind above the fray. Who we are and how we are is contingently shaped by the histories that we have inherited. And I think Hegel is the great philosopher. So every once in a while, I just try to bring a little bit of Hegel down to a lower shelf, because I really think it gets this point, which has spiritual ramifications. Yeah. The Plato piece, we'd have to think about that more. There is a lot of resonance between Descartes and Plato that complicates it. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Yes.
Kind of a little humor. I see this book on how to inhabit time. And I'm wondering if I buy this tonight, I think I will learn a few things from it. But should I also go out and buy a new Apple Watch? How does the Apple Watch and this book go together? In other words, and I noticed, I don't think you have a watch on.
I do.
Oh,
I
it's
do.
an
It's
Apple
not an
Watch.
apple, no.
But I don't know,
Yeah.
we are so consumed
Yeah.
with the Apple Watch
Yeah.
or our
Yeah.
phone.
Yes.
And here
There is a little bit of a conversation in the book about this. I would say this. I do think the book is really meant to invite people into, and you'll appreciate this because we share an honesty and heritage. It's really inviting people into a contemplative space. So this book is not necessarily about giving you all the answers. It's about sort of inviting you into a state of reflection and contemplation where you're like sort of encountering some things that you might have otherwise. And I think to get to that place, we have to set aside a bunch of things that vie for our attention, like our smartwatches, like our phones, whatever it might be. Not a Luddite. All I'm saying is, I think there is something about a way of attending to our histories that needs our attention. And my friend Derek, we were just at a faculty senate meeting where he said, well, how'd you put it? Attention is the most valuable thing that we have. And there are so many aspects of our culture that are trying to steal it from us. And to get it back and to use it then to ask God, when am I? What have you given me? What have I inherited? What are you calling me towards? That's what we're talking about.
I have so enjoyed the first, well, I've enjoyed the whole presentation, but your first few 2 or 3 minutes, and when you said what you were going to do,
Okay, good.
I recommend to your publisher and publicist to take that content
Great.
and advertise this book.
I think we might have a video that does that.
Well, because what they say on the website and advertise, I don't connect with it. It's too,
Yeah.
it's too up there. And this is a book for
Yes.
the general reader.
By the way, before we close, can I say one other thing?
Yeah.
See the cover. Have you done this? Yeah.
I have.
It's very pretty. The little story. This is Paula Gibson's work. I'm going to take her probably later this week. This is a painting by a Swiss painter actually named Felix Viaton, and Deanna and I went to an amazing exhibit at the Met probably 4 years ago, and I absolutely fell in love with this painter. And Paula came up with this cover design, and then Jeremy supported this beautiful idea of actually wrapping the whole book in it. So it's a beautiful artifact. I'm very grateful for Brazos, the way they invest in making beautiful books, enduring beautiful artifacts. And so it's a pleasure, and I'm very proud to have it.
Yeah, you said you're gonna buy one. I recommend two. Let me ask one last question.
Okay.
Last night we had a Q&A with our launch online, and somebody asked, I thought, really great question, kind of almost like struggling a little bit, like, how do I put this into practice? How do I live into a future? And you had, when you said golf, I was like, where is he going with this? And then I thought it was a really good. So why don't we close that? And
Okay.
golf.
So how does living toward the future affect how I live now? Okay, so this is the metaphor I came up with off the top of my head, but maybe it's gonna stick. Should be in the book. How many of you are golfers? Okay, you look like a golfer. One of the things that I've always sort of puzzled over is when you're learning to golf, you know, it's all about how you're gonna hit the ball. But everybody keeps talking about what you're gonna do after you hit the ball. Do you know what I mean? So much of the swing is about your follow through. And I've never quite, for the longest time, I never understood it, because it's like, well, look, everything I do after this, the ball is already gone. So why are we getting? And then I realized, oh, it's because depending on how I intend to follow through, completely affects how my club face hits the ball at that moment. In other words, it's precisely how I intend my future that transforms how it's experienced right now. And in that sense, this is exactly why, as the people of God who are longing for a coming kingdom, in a sense, the way we intend our future comes back to shape the way that we are living now. And that's sort of, I guess, the upshot of it all.
Thank you. Becky, do I need to